Please join me in welcoming Delana Brand. She's a Vice President, People Experience, and the Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter. James Moman, he's the Senior Vice President and Chief Equity Officer at 3M. And Lori Valle Yanez, Head of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion at MassMutual. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Good to see you all. Well, we have quite a group here, and we only have a short amount of time. So I want to lead off first with employees and the whole notion of employee engagement. James, you joined 3M last December after nearly 20 years of D&I work at General Mills, I believe. 3M announced a $50 million five-year social justice fund. What role are employees playing in how those funds are distributed, and why?
Yeah, Karen, thanks for the question, and I'm happy to be here. We've really felt it was critically important as the organization redoubles its efforts in the equity space to really make sure we brought our employees along on that journey. Obviously, we made a significant investment, $50 million over 5 years, as you referenced, but we really wanted to make sure the voices of our employees, particularly our employee resource networks, were engaged as we decided how to deploy those funds and what community organizations would benefit from those resources. So we took essentially the last year to work with our ERNs, investigate local nonprofit partners to collaborate with, and the ERNs' voices, their assessment were really critical to some of the choices we made on $1 million worth of that $50 million investment. And so we announced 2 weeks ago some of the benefactors of that initial $1 million investment from our employee resource networks. And again, it gives them an opportunity to commit to supporting those organizations in our communities. They feel some responsibility. Their voices were critically important in how we assessed and decided to deploy those resources. So again, that collaboration between employees and the organization are just going to be critical moving forward as well.
And how important was it, especially because the George Floyd case was a national story, but it was also a local story? How important was that employee engagement piece for your company in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously being a Twin Cities company, there is an added responsibility to be a positive voice for change as we address some of these issues in our Twin Cities community, but frankly more nationally as well. And so the $50 million that I mentioned earlier and the $1 million from our employee resource networks were devoted to Twin Cities organizations that are going to help us address some of the racial equity issues that we face. Obviously, the trauma and the tragedy of the last year has impacted 3Mers around the world, but in particular those who live in the Twin Cities. And so giving them outlets to be part of solutions versus trying to almost languishing in the trauma and the tragedy of the last year, we really wanted to have positive outlets. This is just one. There's obviously a ton of volunteer activity that goes on in the community as well that we provide 3Mers access to. But again, this was one significant way for our employee resource networks to elevate their voices and really be positive, part of the solution and positive benefactors of those solutions.
So, Delana, I want to go to you next, staying with the employees. At Twitter, employee involvement in DEI is seen as a company-building exercise, work that gets recognized at review time and at compensation for some of the employee leaders. Explain the logic behind that for us, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is something that is extremely important because if you fundamentally believe that diversity and inclusion is a business imperative and that it really is a key component to driving the success of a company, then you have to recognize the contribution and the impact of those individuals who are in the organization doing the hard work and showing up every day trying to make a difference. It's really not any different than any other part of the organization where you recognize performance. And so this is something that I'm proud of, have changed at Twitter. Clearly, everyone at Twitter is accountable for inclusion and diversity on a day-to-day basis, but the heart and core of our inclusion and diversity efforts are our business resource groups. They not only show up every day and perform their core job function, but they also commit to leading diverse community of tweeps around the world. They help drive our inclusion and belonging efforts and really help shape our next generation of leaders. And so we need to commit to show up for them like they show up for us. And so that led to two fundamental shifts or changes at Twitter. First, we introduced a new compensation program, as you said, that pays them not just for their core day-to-day job, but also pays them for the work that they do in inclusion and diversity every single day. No more side hustles at Twitter, as we say. And second, equally important, is that we needed to ensure that they were fully supported to really lean into this work without having to be concerned about it being viewed as distracting from their day-to-day job. And so what we did is completely reshape our performance management process to incorporate and recognize company building activities like inclusion and diversity work so that it is embedded in decisions like performance assessments and promotion decisions and talent planning. So the bottom line really is, if you say the work is valued, then you really need to treat it as such.
So, Lori, I want to come to you and really continue this this business imperative talk. MassMutual started its DEI journey back in 2007, I believe, just before you joined the company. And
Yes.
From what I understand, they wanted to kind of move beyond just some of the programs they were doing to really seeing results, right? This building and baking in this business imperative. And we're already getting some questions from the audience. They want to know, how do you drive that business imperative internally? Delana already gave us a little hint, I think. She used the word accountability. Can you talk a little bit about that business imperative?
Well, I would say that I'm very lucky because, as you said, I joined in 2008. In 2007, there was already a sense of that. I always say our diversity journey started in the business with our sales and marketing organization. There was a sense that there was an opportunity from a business perspective. So it started with our CEO and our board and our executive team. So when I came on board, I had partners at the table, which was really great. So I didn't have to sell the business case to them, but we definitely needed to make sure that we got the rest of the organization on board. And I would say we've been on our journey for a long time. And about 2015, we decided that we wanted to really focus on education to help people understand. I felt like you need to have the right mindsets in order to drive the right behaviors. So we've doubled down on the education space, and we're talking about transformative learning, so people understand their behavior and the way that they look at the world matters. So first we started there, and then we said, well, how do we drive accountability? And we landed with a way to hold everybody accountable by making it part of company performance. And that was in 2017. It's in our annual incentive plan, which is our bonus program. It's a percentage of the bonus program. And just like other things like revenue and sales, it's measured as, if we become a more diverse organization, that's good from a business perspective. So we've been doing that since 2017. And the other thing that we did was we thought it was important to be very transparent. So we started sharing, which is very different for an organization like ours, to just put our demographics out to all of our employees. But that's what we did in 2017 when we made D&I a part of company performance, because people needed to know what they were being held accountable for. So that's kind of been the magic formula that leads us to where we are today. And I would say that, maybe a little bit better prepared, I would say, for everything that happened last year. I think that we were at it a little bit longer, and we've had conversations that were difficult and challenging for a long time. But I didn't have to sell so much about the business case. There was already a belief in it, if that's making sense. We still have to. We still have to talk about why it's important from a business perspective. Yeah.
And James, I see you nodding. Is this resonating with you, this notion of really holding managers accountable and building it into the company structure? What do you do at your company?
Yeah, I mean, the part that resonates with me is that, look, I think it's critically important that senior executives support the work that we all do in diversity and inclusion. It's critically important that the top of the organization advocates, but I always say that our efforts fall apart in the middle of the organization. And so if we don't have ways to engage with middle managers, to give them the understanding for why this matters, why it should be relevant to their day-to-day interactions with employees, some of the decisions that they make on talent, but then also holding them accountable for the progress we all need to make. Again, we can't make progress as an organization if the entire organization isn't rowing in the same direction, and middle managers are just essentially important to the progress that we'll make in all of our respective organizations. So senior leadership is critically important, but how we cascade that accountability and that leadership throughout the organization, especially at middle management level, is critically important.
So, Delana, what are you doing at your company to get those middle managers, keep them aware, but also motivated to deliver?
Yeah, it's so critically important. You can't change, the sort of culture of the organization with or leadership just at the top or programs that come out of corporate. It really is the day-to-day experiences that are shaped by managers and the everyday employees. And so we do a couple different things. First, we have embedded within the business inclusion and diversity business partners that work very, very closely with our HR business partners and managers to create programs and to offer support for managers to learn how to lead more inclusively, hire more inclusively, and just make sure they're equipped to support the very diverse workforce that we have. The other thing that I think is really important, back to the accountability, is that we are really, really holding managers accountable for driving inclusion and diversity in the organization. We've recently launched an inclusive manager badge, which essentially is a program of recognition for managers who get this right. So they've got to do a whole host of things, including a toolkit of trainings. They've got to make sure that they're creating the right sort of cultural environment as measured by the inclusion index that we have as a part of our engagement scores. And we're sort of tracking that, if you will. But through the efforts of them being accountable and that being very visible to folks around the organization, we're starting to see managers change their approach and really get involved and embracing this notion of really, really having a diverse workforce and being very inclusive and embracing sort of the diverse thoughts and experiences of everyone on their teams.
I want to move on to other stakeholders, but very quickly, Lori, I think you may play into this as well, and perhaps James. How does technology help? Are there any particular tools that you're using that you think is particularly helpful? James or Lori?
I will share that we are sharing. I wanted to just mention we have a manager leader program or a leader program to build DEI capabilities throughout the organization. And it's the same thing. We're trying to give them the right level of education, give them the right tools, drive the same level of transparency and accountability through all the layers of management. And we have a commitment to get through all of our managers in 2022, but we've already involved about 700 of our middle managers through this program. So we're measuring inclusion by measuring the level of cultural competence of our leaders. So there's a tool that we're using, and some people are very familiar with it. It's the Intercultural Development Inventory. That is an instrument, an assessment, if you will, to measure your cultural competence. And we've started using that back also in 2015. And so we've measured everybody's cultural competence. We told them that we don't care where you land as long as you commit to getting better over time. And we've retested twice. And we've seen the level of cultural competence across the organization grow. And that's recently I just had a meeting with our board of directors and shared that. We went from a 20% at the highest levels of cultural competence, and now we're at 50% of our leaders are at the highest level of cultural competence. So we're using that tool. Most people use it as a self-assessment, as a developmental in nature, and it should be. But what we're doing, we're taking the collective and saying, where are we landing holistically as an organization? So that's one tool that I will share.
Hey, Karen, can I add one more quick?
Yes.
On the technology side, I do think it's critically important that companies invest in workforce analytics and data analytics. We talk about data analytics when it comes to driving the business. In this space as well, the ability to have powerful data to help drive differential decisions in the organization is just critically important. This area is not short of having access to data, but what you do with that data to drive insights and drive behavior change is critically important. So if I was going to encourage anyone to invest in any resources, it really is that workforce analytics and the ability to drive insights from our D&I data.
And this ties into the next question I was going to ask, and this is another question that's kind of popular with our audience as well. Do your customers, your investors, your shareholders, financial markets, do they appreciate how important this work is to you? Clearly, this is you're passionate about this work. Do they appreciate why this work is so important to you? By you meaning your companies. This is a business imperative. And how do you communicate that? Is part of this communication having the data, having the intelligence to be able to tell people this is what we're doing, why, and here are the results? Anyone, James, Delana, anyone?
Go ahead. Well, I'll just say
Delana.
This is something that we have to recognize, that no one company can sort of solve diversity, equity, inclusion by itself, right? We need the entire ecosystem of corporate America, even beyond that, if you will, to come together on these things, and all the priorities have to be aligned as such. And the good news is usually it is around things like profitability and growth, which is why it's so important to make sure that from an inclusion and diversity perspective, you have really connected your I&D journey, if you will, to the business, that it's a part of the business. And so as you're having those conversations with investors, with shareholders and other key stakeholders, that you are not talking about it sort of, off by itself, but it is integrated into sort of everything that you're doing. That's how we approach it at Twitter. So we have diversity and equity and inclusion goals. We share those with the board on a quarterly basis. We share those externally as a part of our publications or in our annual inclusion and diversity report. We have a corporate impact report that we share with investors and shareholders to demonstrate all the progress. And at the core is that analytics. It is truly the data and us tracking our progress sort of against those things. So it's incredibly powerful. I think that at the end of the day, go ahead.
We have an audience question. What kind of metrics are you actually using, and how do those metrics affect day to day? If someone has a really good granular example of a metric that you actually look at and how that might affect your day to day. That's something that you really measure.
A whole host of metrics, everything from the core basic sort of, representation metrics, all the way through those experiences that we talked about around inclusion. Are managers creating an inclusive experience as measured by our inclusion index, if you will. So we're tracking everything end to end in the entire employment life cycle as it relates to those core decisions around inclusion and diversity and how that shows up.
And I would imagine perhaps James and Lori, issues around retention. Retention would be another metric that you would also track. I want to make sure we have time for this. We only have about 5 minutes left. Clearly, this has been a very trying time. We've had George Floyd's murder. We've had the coronavirus. We've had the Great Recession. These were not the first shocks to our system. These are not going to be the last, right? We have questions about how DI offices prepare for the future, right? Which is crystal balling. Delana, you shared when we were chatting earlier about back in 2018, Twitter started to decentralize its workforce in a way to diversify. So that years later, when COVID-19 landed, you already had some experience with remote work, and we're not going to try to tackle remote work now. The point is that because of some things that were done before, you're already ahead of the curve. And that's something that you all have touched on a bit. Just thinking about DEI can set you up well for things that might come up that you just can't anticipate. The question, though, has been asked, where should DEI sit? Is it an HR function? Where should it sit? Delana, does it matter where DEI sits? Should it sit in HR?
Yeah, I think this question comes up a lot, and I think a lot of folks are struggling with it. And I answer very clearly: it doesn't matter. There is no best organizational structure for DEI. What matters least is where the position sits, and what matters most is sort of the who, what, and where in terms of where the biggest impact at the end of the day is going to be had, and where the accountability actually is going to reside. And that's going to be different for every organization. We all know that in an ideal world, like, our roles should not even exist, right? There shouldn't be an office of DEI anywhere. It should just be how business is done, and it should be culturally embedded in the organization. At Twitter, what is most important for us is the integration of DEI in everything that we do end to end in all of our people, programs, and processes, which is why my role is accountable for more than just DE&I. I also have things like global compensation, so I can make sure we're driving pay equity. I have global benefits to make sure that we are really offering and designing inclusive benefits. And again, that's going to look different for every organization. So for me, it's all about building the structure around accountability and where it's going to happen most in the organization.
Lori, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree that it's less about where you're sitting, and I think it's more about the access that you have to the decision makers in the organization and how much influence you can have with them wherever you're sitting. So I've not had, I've reported to the head of HR, and I've reported to, wasn't called a CEO. I worked in a laboratory, a scientific laboratory, but reporting into other leaders. And I think that it's the same. Just having the access and the ability to influence leaders, the ability to get in front of the board of directors, to have the conversations. I think those are the things that matter and help us to get to where we want to be. And it doesn't hurt to be in the, the human capital part of the organization, because the employee piece is such a big piece.
And James, you're newest in your role at your company, right? What have you learned over the past? I guess it's been around the past 6 months. What have you learned? Is there anything that how you would structure any part of your team differently for those people who may be adding new teams or restructuring teams, or perhaps just beefing up their teams?
Yeah, the one piece I'll close with, that's unique to 3M, or relatively unique in the space, is I do think historically our D&I roles have been primarily focused on what happens in the four walls of the organization. One of the unique parts of my job is I also have responsibility for our external engagement. So our foundation, our philanthropic efforts, our community engagement efforts sit in my organization as well, because I think there is an intersection between the two. Again, as I talked about earlier, employee resource groups do a lot of work internal to the organization to drive our culture of belonging and inclusion. There's a tremendous amount of impact they can have externally as well. We're starting to see the intersection of external and internal. And again, in my capacity, it gives me the resources, the funds, and the opportunities to engage and drive change when it comes to equity, both internally and externally. So that's just one nuance that I would call out.
All righty, guys. Well, thank you so very much. Delana, Vice President, People Experience and Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter. James, Senior Vice President, Chief Equity Officer at 3M. And Lori, Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at MassMutual. And Lori, I'm going to leave with the last word will be something you said. Don't be afraid of failure. Thank you for joining us.